Hey everyone, Hellhog here, and you may know me as Aeyix on the Shadowlands. I wanted to make a Gunnery Commando guide, which is something I neglected to do in 3.0. I also have an Imperial side version for you mercenary users. If you'd like the Arsenal version of this guide, you can find that, as well as Innovative Ordnance, Assault Specialist, Assassin, and Shadow guides in the description below or on my YouTube channel. This guide will focus on the PvE side of Gunnery and is broken up into 6 parts. Timestamps to the separate parts can be found in the description below if you'd like to skip ahead. 6 parts are Gunnery's purpose and usefulness in flashpoints and operations, gearing overview, utilities overview, abilities overview, the rotation, and finally an example dummy parse. Let's get started. Overall, Gunnery in operations and flashpoints is a fantastic discipline. It sits in the top tier of DPS, only second to gunslingers for ranged classes, yet is far superior in mobility. It has both great sustained and burst damage, only suffering slightly in the area of effect department due to small overall radius, high cost, and long cooldowns of the AoE abilities. Survivability is made easy with the correct utility choices and moderately okay cooldowns, as well as the ability to off-heal. The rotation itself is arguably the easiest in the game with very little worry for energy management and the ability to target switch on the dime. Unlike in 3.0, where Gunnery was one of the worst parsing disciplines and greatly outshined by its big brother Assault Specialist, now it matches up quite well. Although technically still lower parsing than AS, the difference is so slim that with Gunnery's ability to stop and pick up its rotation with no problem, little to no worry about energy management, better AoE, and the better diversion cooldown in most circumstances, Gunnery has become the de facto choice for most Commando players. Given all the above, Gunnery is viable in all fights for flashpoints and operations, including Nightmare mode. Before you go any further with this guide, if you haven't done so yet, I highly recommend you go through and read all the tooltips and descriptions in your discipline and abilities pane so you are familiar with the class, its buffs, abilities, and cooldowns. Now let's go over gearing. For those of you watching from my Commando guides, don't mind the fact that I'm on a mercenary. Gearing for Commandos and mercenaries is practically the same, and for the sake of simplicity and being able to show and discuss what I want, I'm on my mercenary since it's better geared. For those of you looking for more detailed information, discussion, and theory crafting around gearing, I highly recommend going to the SWTOR forums and checking out Bant's forum thread on gearing in 4.0. There's a lot of great information there, and if you have any questions, you can probably get them answered there. There'll be a link to that page in the video description below. So let's talk about the main difference between Commandos and mercenaries, and that's the main hand offhand. Mercenaries will use dual blaster pistols, where the offhand blaster pistol deals significantly less damage than the main hand pistol, as well as having significantly less accuracy rating. Commandos, on the other hand, will use an assault cannon, which deals more damage than a blaster pistol in the main hand slot, and that's to make up for the lack of an offhand blaster pistol. In the offhand slot, a commando will use a generator to acquire tech power. As you note here on the left, the stat sheet for a commando, the primary damage is higher than that of a mercenary, but there is no secondary damage slot. One other key thing I want to go over that's the difference between disciplines and not so much classes is that Innovative Ordnance and Assault Specialist will have a different looking stat sheet than Arsenal and Commando. Pardon me, in Arsenal and Gunnery. You'll note here that the critical chance for ranged will go up by 5% in IOAS, while the alacrity will drop by 3% for IOAS, as you'll note now when I change stances. So I'll go ahead and show that again. So let's get started on the actual gearing aspect. In PvE, bosses have a 10% defense resist chance. So to counter that, we want to make sure we hit 110% tech and 110% ranged accuracy. This way we don't miss, and we increase our DPS significantly. And we do this 2 ways, by hitting 684 accuracy rating, as well as getting our companion buffs. If you go to your legacy pane, go to Global Unlocks under Imperial or Republic classes, you'll notice that completing conversation lines with companions grant buffs to your stats. The most important one being accuracy, which gives you a 1% increase in overall accuracy to all the tunes on your legacy. Other ones provide bonuses to crit chance, crit damage, healing received, and max health, and those are all very important to get. But the big one that I stress that you should get is accuracy. Now, you don't have to do it on a bounty hunter or on a trooper. Let's say you completed conversation lines with Lord Scourge for a Jedi Knight. That will grant the accuracy bonus to all the characters on your legacy. So that's important to get as it helps increase DPS further. Now, the way we get 684 accuracy rating is twofold. The first method is the method I like to use, and the reason I go with this method is A, because I was already doing this before proficient stems came around and I didn't want to change my gearing, and also because I PvE and PvP, and switching between the two it's easier to stick with the same stem. So in this method we use a versatile stem which grants mastery and power. And to get our accuracy, we use 2 initiative enhancements, which are the best in slot accuracy enhancements available, and 5 accuracy augments. Alternatively, you can use a polybiotic proficient stem, which instead of mastery and power grants accuracy and crit rating. You will still use 2 initiative enhancements, but now instead of 5 you will only use 2 accuracy augments. Doing this in 220 and 224 gear will grant you the accuracy cap with the minimum amount of wasted stat. If you're in 216 gear, you'll be just under the accuracy cap, but that's not a big deal for the content you'll be playing in 216 gear. As a note, for mercenary users, because your offhand is still under 110% accuracy, that extra accuracy stat is actually not wasted, like it is for commandos and most other classes in the game. Now, going into set bonuses, for commandos and mercenaries, you want to make sure you use the eliminator set bonus, as that's what grants bonuses to your damage, decreases cooldowns on one of your defensives, and gives you auto crits. Now for actual individual gearing, once I've hit my accuracy cap, I personally like around 800 alacrity and 1300 critical rating for both IOAS and Arsenal Gunnery. From there, you can kind of play around with what works best for you and what you prefer, but this is what I've come to like and what works best for me. Now, you'll get accuracy enhancements when you turn in tokens in the glove slot, the feet slot, as well as the offhand slot. And one thing that you have the luxury for a bounty hunter is that there's also a heal class involved with bounty hunters and troopers. So since you only need 2 accuracy enhancements, once you get it in the hands and feet, you don't need to get it in the offhand as well, so get the healer offhand when you turn in an offhand token, which I believe is called the combat medic piece. So if you get that, you'll get a critical enhancement, and it just reduces the amount of min-maxing that you have to do. Now the way I get the rest of my stats is you'll get only an alacrity enhancement through the headpiece. So if you want more alacrity, you need to do that through either the earpiece, implants, or you'll just have to rip from other sets that you turn in. Now I use an alacrity in the headpiece, and then the rest are crit, with the exception of the 2 accuracy enhancements. And then for augments, outside the 5 accuracy augments I use, the rest of my augments are all alacrity. And this is what provides my alacrity and critical rating that you see here. I've tried power augments and I've tried mastery augments. I've tried less crit and more alacrity and vice versa, and I find that for IOAS and Arsenal Gunnery, this is what works best for me, and this is what provides the most DPS on boss fights and parsing. I would recommend trying to get at least 800 alacrity and 1300 crit once you've hit your accuracy cap, and then kind of play with it from there to see what works best for you. I don't recommend augmenting for mastery since we're hitting high diminishing returns with the crit chance you get from mastery, and instead, if you are going to do such a thing, augment toward power. However, the current meta and what I've found is that augmenting power does not provide as much DPS as augmenting for crit and alacrity does. So this is gearing for IOAS and Arsenal Gunnery in a nutshell. Utility choices for PvE Gunnery is pretty simple for the most part. You'll use the same utilities for most fights, which is nice. Tenacious Defense for the most part is very situational and is PvP focused, so we won't worry about it too much. Concussive Force is PvP, so again we won't worry about it. Heavy Trooper is a very small, slight survivability increase. It's not too noticeable, but it's enough that it's worth taking in most scenarios. Paralactic Combat Stims isn't really necessary in Gunnery. Energy management's very easy. It's more AS oriented, and for the most part, if you're knocked around in Gunnery, you'll regain that energy back the same anyway, so there are better utilities worth taking. Cell Capacitor is very nice to take. It allows you to get an extra grav round off. Otherwise, and also the 10% alacrity increase is a DPS increase. And Charged Barrier is a survivability increase. As you do your rotation, you gain 5% more damage reduction, which is nice to have, makes the healer's life easier, makes your life easier. If there is a lot of AoE to do and you plan on using Hail of Bolts a lot, it's worth replacing Heavy Trooper with Chain Gunnery, just for the damage increase that you'll get for your Hail of Bolts attack. And then lastly, Sticky Mods is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. In the Masterful tier, hold advanced the line is seemingly nice, however unnecessary. Hold the line already lasts 6 seconds, and unless you absolutely need 10 seconds to hold the line, it's not really worth taking. There are better utilities. Electro Shield's nice to have. Whenever you're taking a lot of damage, you pop Reactive Shield and you actually dish more damage back, so you get to do a little bit extra DPS, and it's nice to have. Night Vision Scope is PvP, so we don't worry about it. Suit FOE is very situational. If there's a period where you're taking significant amount of damage, the raid in general, and you have a non-cleansable periodic effect on you, it's worth taking just to reduce that damage by 30%. It's essentially another cooldown, and it makes the healer's life easier. It increases your survivability. So only in those situations is it worth having. I also like to take Med Zone a lot, because when you're taking a lot of damage, you pop Reactive Shield. Maybe everybody's taking a lot of damage. It makes the healer's job easier for keeping you up and increases your survivability, and thus helps out the raid as a whole. If that's not necessary though, I like to replace Med Zone with Combat Shield, so if I'm taking enough damage that's causing pushback on my grav round, I'll go ahead and use this so that it doesn't reduce my APM, lets me maintain my DPS. Efficient Conversions is for the most part useless, so we don't worry about it at all. Supercharged Defense seems nice, however nothing's going to interrupt us in PvE, and 15% defense chance really isn't that significant, not to mention we should be using Supercharged Cell whenever we have 10 stacks. We don't even get to choose when the cooldown will occur for the most part, so it makes it not that nice. It doesn't really make it that great to have in PvE. In the Heroic tier, Reflexive Shield is only worth taking if there's a lot of trickle damage coming in, as well as 0 AoE damage. Energy readout that occurs isn't very useful against infrequent and heavy-hitting attacks. It's really good against more frequent, smaller attacks, as well as the reduction to your Reactive Shield cooldown is only good if there's a lot of attacks coming in, versus dishing out smaller attacks. You may not reduce the cooldown that much that it's necessary. Overclock isn't the worst, but there are better utilities out there. To be able to have 2 charges with Tech Override isn't bad, however for the most part you won't really find yourself in a situation where you have to be mobile and just constantly spam grav round, not to mention you have other abilities available to use in place in those scenarios. Shock Absorbers is something I take for most fights because it's a 30% AoE damage reduction, as well as 30% damage while you're stunned, or 30% damage reduction while you're stunned, which is nice to have. Reflexive Battery is pretty much PvP, so we don't worry about it. Supercharged Reserves is kind of useless. We can build stacks just by popping Med Shot before a fight, so we don't need to use this at all. Culto Waves is useless as a DPS. Force March is probably the best utility we can take. It allows us to use our Bolt Storm while moving, which allows us to obey mechanics while maintaining DPS a lot easier. And then lastly, Smokescreen is PvP, so again, something we don't really worry about. So this is what I pretty much take for the most part in Gunnery, with the slight differences is I'll change Med Zone for Combat Shield, and in AoE scenarios I'll trade Heavy Trooper for Chain Gunnery. Next we're going to go over all the offensive and defensive cooldowns available for Gunnery. To start, there are 3 main defensive cooldowns. Adrenaline Rush, that when activated will rapidly start healing us up to 40% for 8 seconds. Additionally, you can use it when you're above 40% health, however it will not trigger until you're at below 40%. Once it's triggered, or once it's gone a minute without being used, it will then go on cooldown for 3 minutes. We also have Reactive Shield, that when used will give us 25% damage reduction for 12 seconds. Any utilities related to it, such as Electro Shield, will also activate. If you have the 4-piece set bonus, it will also reduce your cooldown from 2 minutes to 1 minute 45 seconds for Reactive Shield. Our final main cooldown is Diversion, that when activated gives us 5 charges that will absorb incoming direct force or tech attacks and lasts up to 10 seconds. So it doesn't work against dots, but it works against direct attacks. Now if you're spec'd into it for some situational reason, using Field Aid on yourself will also give you 30% damage reduction to periodic effects for 12 seconds. You can also use Field Aid on yourself or a friendly player to cleanse tech or physical effects off of them, but it will not work against mental effects. So that covers all the defensive cooldowns. For offensive cooldowns, we have Supercharged Cell, that when used in armor-piercing cell increases armor penetration by 10% for 8 seconds, while also increasing alacrity based on using certain abilities. So you'll notice here when I use Grav Round, my alacrity goes up. We also have Reserve Power Cell, that when used, prevents us from depleting any energy for our next ability, so if I pop Demolition Round, you'll notice my energy didn't go down at all. We also have Tech Override, where normally with Grav Round, we'll have to charge it. But if we pop Tech Override beforehand, we can use Grav Round on the move. But now you'll notice it says cannot do that while moving, because we burned the one charge of Tech Override. Now should we get ourselves into energy trouble, which is a little harder to do in Gunnery, we can use Recharge Cells to immediately get back that energy. As you see, it puts you back in a favorable situation. So those are all the offensive cooldowns. There's also a couple gap closers available. Hold the Line for one when used will make you immune to knockbacks and roots, while also improving your mobility by 30% for the 6-second duration of Hold the Line. We also have Propulsion Round, which you can just use to move backwards really quick, or with some fancy camera work, you can use like a gap closer. Since we're also a DPS/heal class, we have access to off heals, so we can med shot ourselves or a friendly player, which costs no energy whatsoever. We also have Bacta Infusion, which is an instant heal. And then we have Medical Probe, which requires casting. However, if we have enough stacks of charged barrels, Medical Probe will also be available to do instantly. We also have 2 raid utility available to us. One is Supercharged Celerity, that when popped, increases the raid group's alacrity by 10% for 10 seconds, and then puts the raid group on cooldown from being able to use it again for 5 minutes. We also have Emergency Medical Probe available, which is also known as a Battle Res, and will let us revive somebody in the middle of a battle. And it's a lot better that we do it instead of a healer. This way the healer doesn't have to focus their heals off the group in order to revive somebody. And that pretty much covers all the offensive and defensive cooldowns available to Gunnery. Before we finally get into an example parse for Gunnery, I want to briefly go over the rotation. You can pause the video here to read this if you'd like. I'll also include a link in the description so you can download this. So to get started, Gunnery rotation is pretty simple for the most part. We just try to use every ability as soon as we can off cooldown, and we try not to clip or burn any current of fire procs. So the stance we'll be in is Armor Piercing Cell. For the opener, make sure we do not start with Bolt Storm. It's an unprocced Bolt Storm, which means it deals less damage, plus we're not getting our cooldown abilities used quick enough. Instead, we start off with Grav Round, which will proc, or not proc, but boost our Demolition Round's damage. We use other cooldown based abilities before we finally burn our Bolt Storm proc. Now, alternatively, you can also have Vortex Bolt and Electronet swapped here. If you do so, then you will use Bolt Storm before Vortex Bolt at the end here. Otherwise, just follow this opener, and then once you get through it, you go right into the priority, which is to try and use Demolition Round on cooldown, try to use High Impact Bolt as soon as it has 5 stacks of Charged Barrel, try to use Vortex Bolt and cooldown, Electronet cooldown. Grav Round is your main filler ability, and you will only use Hammer Shot should you need to spare the energy. If you're low on energy, then that's your no-cost auto attack. Now, something to note with current of fire procs, they do last 15 seconds, however they're procced every 8 seconds, so it's imperative to try and use Bolt Storm when procced as soon as possible. If you delay it for 3 or more GCDs, then you run the risk of pushing a proc later, and then you do less Bolt Storms over the course of a parse or a boss fight. So do note also that when using Grav Round, if it's casted, that means that the proc occurred at the end of the GCD, which is the global cooldown. If Grav Round is instant because of Tech Override or Vortex Bolt, then that means it was at the start of the global cooldown. Some situational attacks to take note. Outside of our normal rotation, let's say we have to be mobile, which is something that's very common in most fights, you can pop Tech Override followed by Grav Round, assuming there's nothing else on this list that you can do that has no mobility restriction. If that's not available, you can, if you are in melee range, you can Stock Strike, which does just as much damage as a Grav Round would. However, do note that Stock Strike does not proc Current of Fire, and it will not give you Charged Barrel stacks. Now, should none of those be the case, you can also use explosive round. Do note though, explosive round is more expensive than grav round, so using it too often could put you into energy trouble. And if nothing else is available, you can just use hammer shot, because that's better than nothing, and it won't put you into any energy issues. For area of effect rotation, you'll pretty much just use mortar volley, and then go straight into using hail of bolts, assuming you also use the utility that gives it a 25% damage increase. If the adds that you're AoEing are not close enough to each other, then you can also use plasma grenade and sticky grenade. I typically never use sticky grenade. Once in a while I will throw out a plasma grenade though. And that's the gunnery rotation in a nutshell. And now finally the moment you've been waiting for, unless you skipped ahead of course, and that's the example Gunnery Commando Parse. Now before I get started, some things to go over real quick is I'll have a keyboard in the bottom left showing keystrokes that I'm using, as well as star parse in the top right to show stats from the parse, and SWTOR caster to show the abilities I'm using. If you're interested in seeing this parse in further detail, there'll be a link to it in the description below. Before I get started, just want to show my character sheet real quick since I showed my merc earlier in the video. It's not exactly ideal since the left side's 208 unaugmented, but that's okay. Other thing to go over is before you do any type of parse is you want to use an armor reduction module on the dummy, as well as a health modulator. 1.5 million is preferred, but I'll be using 1 million in this instance just for time purposes. Now before we ever pull any boss, we want to make sure we build up 10 stacks of supercharge by using our med shot, and we should do that before any boss pull. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to use a cooldown real quick, just for energy management purposes. Gonna hammer shot, also for energy management. And I'm gonna go ahead and burn another cooldown. So now I know if I get myself into heat trouble, I won't have anything available for a while. Pardon me, energy trouble. So just gotta be extra careful about that. So I'm just gonna hammer shot there for energy management. I'm going to use a cooldown on this grab round. Now I can start burning energy because I don't have to worry about running out before the fight's over. And actually the fight is over, so I could have done that earlier. But that's an example, Gunnery Commando Parse. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you found this guide to be helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them in the comment section below and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. Feel free to share this video, and as always, stay sharp out there.